No, I don't think it is. It's a perennial of the sort of political cycle that when parties start limbering up for general elections, they want to make pledges of the money that they can spend and put in their shop window goodies in front of the voting public. But they don't want to commit to tax rises, of course. So they say, I know, we'll get more money from the people who should be paying more tax, from tax evasion, which, of course, is illegal, and tax avoidance, which is the legal use of tax law to navigate, if you like, to pay as little as is legally possible. Evasion and avoidance are very different. I think what is slightly more eye-catching by the Shadow Chancellor this morning, Rachel Reeves, is that she's linking the money that she wants to spend to a report by the National Audit Office. The National Audit Office, if you like, is like the government's own accountant, internal auditor. They look at how government money is spent and how it should be spent a bit better. But let's give Rachel Reeves her due. These are the numbers that she put out this morning, talking about how she's going to clamp down on tax avoidance. Labour's tax plans, they want to raise an extra £2.6 billion a year by the end of the next Parliament. By 2029-30, clamping down on non-dom loopholes. We've talked about this many times. Labour had a policy that they wanted to make it more difficult for wealthy foreigners to declare themselves tax resident abroad, even though they actually live in the UK. The Tories came up with a policy very similar to Labour's, and now Labour have tightened that policy some more. They claim that's going to raise £2.5 billion a year in 5 years' time. Then another £2.4 billion Labour say they can raise from clamping down on other forms of tax evasion. They point to the National Audit Office. They have an estimate of something called the tax gap, which is how much tax should be paid if everyone complied with the law and how much tax actually is paid. That tax gap is something like 30 billion. Labour are claiming that to get 5 billion in total from that is money on the table. They want to spend this, quotes, extra money, which may or may not materialise, of course, on NHS appointments, more dental appointments, trying to tackle those waiting lists, which are now at record levels. An estimated 9 million people in the UK are waiting on an NHS waiting list, and indeed on breakfast clubs where primary schools provide breakfast for kids for free. And Reeves also, she is at pains to point out in every single TV and radio appearance, she says everything in our manifesto will be fully costed and funded. And she says that because, you know, the government's coffers really are stretched tight now, to mix my metaphors. There isn't much money around. Even the Tories would admit that if a Labour government does come in, their inheritance, if you like, the situation they're inheriting in terms of economic growth, public debt, still quite high inflation, is a much more difficult, challenging inheritance than, say, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown inherited when Labour won a landslide back in 1997. So she's trying to manage expectations. She's trying to say to many voters on the left and the left of her own party, we're not going to be able to just let the spending floodgates open because financial markets will push back and we'll have a situation similar to back in the autumn of 2022 when interest rates spiked, mortgage rates spiked, borrowing costs spiked across the economy. So I think you're both right to be slightly sceptical that this extra money can materialise from clamping down on tax evasion and avoidance and clamping down on non-doms. But Rachel Reeves isn't the first Shadow Chancellor to claim that she can conjure up this money from nowhere, and she certainly won't be the last.
No, it does seem that history is repeating itself, not least with sticking to Tory spending limits and rules. Although back when Blair did that in 1997, we had 4% growth. And last time I checked in the UK in January, we had 0.1% growth. So that might be just a touch harder.
And that's right. And when Blair came in, I was a political reporter at the time. Within a couple of years, the UK government was actually running a surplus from year to year, where taxation revenue was higher than spending. The so-called Iron Chancellor, Gordon Brown, really keeping the spending gates firmly shut. Many historians would say, and journalists there at the time, me included, that later in his chancellorship, Brown sort of reverse ferreted and spent probably more money than he should have done. But there could not really be more difference between Rachel Reeves' economic inheritance, if indeed she does become the first female chancellor later this year for a Labour government, and the economic inheritance that Ken Clarke and the Tories bequeathed to Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. History often doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes.